Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Bonjour à tous et soyez les bienvenus à ce séminaire du Forum du Victoria. Welcome to this sixth webinar of the year of the Victoria Forum. My name is Sébastien Beaulieu. I'm Associate Co-Chair of the Victoria Forum, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's great conversation. The Victoria Forum is a partnership between the Senate of Canada and the University of Victoria. Le Forum de Victoria est un beau partenariat, un partenariat novateur entre l'Université de Victoria et le Sénat. Our aim throughout this series of webinars is always to look at ways and means and concrete steps we can take to bridge divides, and today is no exception. And this series of webinars will take us to April 2022, when we hope to meet live in person for a 3-day conference and a series of conversations around bridging divides. L'événement d'aujourd'hui rassemble plus de 200 participants, 200 inscriptions et à une nature vraiment mondiale, avec des participants à travers le Canada évidemment, mais aussi dans une dizaine d'autres pays. Et before pursuing, I'd like to proceed with a territorial acknowledgement, as the Victoria Forum and the University of Victoria acknowledge with respect the LaBoucane peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Sanghees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. This is a virtual space, and we have locations across Canada and the world, so let's acknowledge the lands on which we live, work, and play. And today I'm speaking to you from traditional Algonquin territory in Ottawa. L'enjeu du jour, les universités, la vérité et la réconciliation sont un enjeu important, et on voulait vous présenter cette conversation-ci parce qu'on croit que les universités ont justement un grand rôle à jouer dans cet effort collectif qu'est la vérité et la réconciliation. Universities have a key role to play on this long journey that is truth and reconciliation. So we're pleased to have today's event on the eve of the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. But you'll agree with me that it's not only on the eve or on the day of National Truth and Reconciliation that this issue is topical, but we have to make it topical every single day of the year. J'aimerais maintenant passer la parole à la sénatrice Patti LaBoucane-Benson. She's recognized for her relentless work on research on colonization, historic trauma, and healing. And as a great change maker in Canada, we're pleased to have her moderate today's panel. So, Senator, over to you. Il me fait plaisir de vous passer la parole. À vous. Merci.
Oh, thank you very much, Sebastian, for that kind introduction. I want to start by saying I'm a Métis Ukrainian who grew up on Treaty 6 territory in what was St. Paul de Métis, but is now known as St. Paul, Alberta. I still live on this beautiful Treaty 6 territory, and I want to acknowledge that where I live, we are all treaty people. I'm honored to facilitate this timely webinar today. I want to thank the University of Victoria for including me in this conversation. And we're here to discuss the role of higher education in reconciliation and how universities are responding to the TRC's call to action. And I'm sure the big reason why everybody is here today, and thank you for being here today, is because of our panel of distinguished leaders of Canadian universities. Their bio and information is available at victoriaforum.ca, so I won't go into too much detail and speak about their long list of accomplishments, because you're not the president of a university if you don't have a long list of accomplishments. But I'd like to give them each a moment to provide a territorial acknowledgement and introduce themselves. So let's start with Dr. Kevin Hall, President and Vice-chancellor from the University of Victoria.
Thanks, Senator. And so I am Kevin Hall, as you just mentioned. I'm in my role about 11 months now. I'm a Canadian, spent the past 7 years in Australia, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but I would begin by recognizing land and language. We're on the territories of LaBoucane peoples, the Wasanic, Sanghees, and Esquimalt, whose relationship with this land continues to today. I'd pay my respects to elders past and present, and really commit this institution to decolonization in a way that's meaningful for our local Indigenous populations, and really to embrace the principles of UNDRIP as we work towards self-determination of our local First Nations. And I guess the Australia piece is important. I've been 7 years in Australia, have come back to Canada, and quite frankly, as a Canadian, I'm a little ashamed at the lack of progress since the calls to action in 2015.
Great, thank you very much. Now we'll move to Dr. Vivian Timmins, President and Vice-chancellor for Memorial University. I think you're muted, Dr. Timmins.
Thank you very much. Isn't that always the case? The muted, that will be the comment we have. I am here in Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador, and I'm on the traditional lands of the Beothuk, the Mi'kmaq, the Innu, and the Inuit. And these are important. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge our ancestors whose shoulders we stand on, in particular mine, who are from Conn River, Mi'kmaq community here in Newfoundland and Labrador. And I'm thrilled to be here, both to share some information, but most of all, to learn from my colleagues and all of you. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Timmins. And next we have Professor Christopher Manfredi, Provost and Vice Principal, Academic at McGill.
Merci, sénatrice. Je suis ravi d'être ici pour pouvoir partager les expériences de l'Université McGill sur le chemin à la réconciliation. Of course, I'm also pleased to recognize that McGill University is on land which long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. The university acknowledges and thanks the diverse Indigenous people whose footsteps have marked this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. And it's a pleasure for me to be able to be here and share McGill University's experiences on the road toward reconciliation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And finally, now from my alma mater, where I have not one, not two, but 3 degrees, Professor Bill Flanagan, President, Vice-chancellor at the University of Alberta.
Well, thank you so much, Senator LaBoucane-Benson. I'm really delighted to be here today and part of this panel and the Victoria Forum's webinar series. And I also want to, it's a particular honor to be here today with you because, as you mentioned, you're an alumna of the University of Alberta, and we take enormous pride in your leadership across many domains, including reconciliation, Indigenous family resilience, community and public service, academia, policy development, and now, of course, in the Senate. And I would like to acknowledge that the University of Alberta, its buildings, labs, and research stations are primarily located on the traditional territory of the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, and Anishinaabe nations, lands that are now known as part of Treaties 6, 7, and 8, and homeland of the Métis. And the University of Alberta respects the sovereignty, lands, histories, languages, knowledge systems, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit nations. And I also had the great privilege of being born and raised on these lands, born and raised in Alberta. And it was a real thrill for me to return home after 28 years at Queen's University and join the University of Alberta, which I think has a particularly important mission in Alberta on the path to truth and reconciliation. As you know, a university that was founded shortly after the founding of the province to uplift the whole people. And for too long, the whole people did not include the Indigenous peoples of this land. And so the university has a particular obligation to address that going forward. And so I very much look forward to our discussion today. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you to all the panelists for that very concise introduction. So far, you're following all the rules, and I appreciate that. So let's start our discussion. For the first question, and this is really about the vision of your institution in the process of reconciliation, and I want to give you a good opportunity to talk about it. What is the big overarching plan for your institution to address the calls to action from the TRC, and what has been achieved to date? And we're going to go in that same order, so I'll call first on Dr. Hall.
Thanks, Senator. And as a typical academic, I'll get to your question in a very circuitous route. I wanted to just start off with some of the comments I made earlier about Canadian returning to Canada after 7 years in Australia. And I think a lot of us have all tried to do the same things. We've built strategies to eliminate the education gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous. We've worked on developing appropriate curricular training. We've increased our academic cohort. But I think we tried to do that within the existing frameworks of universities, within the existing governance structures. And I think that's led to some issues. It's meant we've been slow on decolonization across many aspects of our institution. We've been slow on the uptake of UNDRIP, which, interestingly, was first drafted in the early 1900s, was revitalized in 2008. And I think we've been absent in the truth. And I say that because I've seen how far Australia has progressed in the last 7 years. So, what have we been doing at UVic? So I can tell you, lots of things have been going on. And one of the reasons I chose to come to UVic was for its reputation and its leadership it had shown in the past. But it doesn't mean we're perfect. We've tripled the number of Indigenous students attending our university over the past decade. But we've got a lot of work to do with our local First Nations. The Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich communities send very few students to the University of Victoria. We've had success in creating pathway programs, putting academic support programs in for students. We've got an Elders in Residence program, a First Peoples House. We reach out into our communities with support, but we've got a lot more work to do in that place. We've had a success in attracting a terrific cohort of Indigenous academics and scholars. We have over 60 of our 750 academic scholars are Indigenous, but they continue to experience racism on our campus. They continue to pay, if you like, the tax that goes on being an Indigenous professor, where community is important to you, where you're a mentor for everybody, where you're a PhD supervisor for everybody. And that's not really taken into account in our promotion and tenure evaluations, as it should be. We've created the National Center for Indigenous Laws, which I think is a program that the university is extremely proud of, the first in the world. And that's really redefining the way Canadians think about Indigenous law to really properly include and respect the legal orders of the land. And we're doing Indigenous cultural acumen training for faculty and staff. But I guess, it's not enough. And so we're really focusing not on what we've done, but what we're going to do in the future. And we really accept that our responsibility, in addressing truth, respect, and reconciliation is in the act of decolonizing in a way that's meaningful for our local communities. We want to make sure we are leaders in creating our DRIPA plan to really push forward the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we could sit back and wait for the province to mandate this, which it's in the process of doing, but we want to show some leadership in this place. I also want to really work on anti-racism, and anti-racism in Canada is often passive-aggressive. It's sort of under the radar, but it's alive on our campus, as it is on all campuses that I've worked. And so we really want to put a lot of work in that, and not words, but actions. And so we've recently established the Office of the Associate Vice President in Indigenous, Qualtsiamet. Rabina Thomas is our founding Indigenous Vice President, and she's working hard on renewing and refreshing our Indigenous plan, starting in the communities, working with the communities. And in fact, we're on the process of creating a new vision for the whole institution. And our starting point is working with our local First Nations. What do they want their university to look like, to be? What should it do for their community? And that's really important to me. And we're really strongly committed to increasing educational access and success, really, for our Indigenous students, starting with our local communities, with building across Vancouver Island and across the province. And so I think, important for us is to keep our eyes focused on truth, respect, reconciliation, and really to create that environment for our local communities that allows them to flourish and work towards self-determination. I'm really buoyed by the words of one of our esteemed elders, Dr. Skip Dick, who basically says to our students in his address always, do you want to be part of the problem or part of the solution? You choose. And that's the way we really want to push forward and get our students, our staff, faculty really engaged.
That was fantastic and right on time, because I am timing you, and you hit You hit it right on the 4 minutes and 33-second mark. Very good. So now I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Timmins to tell us what the vision for her university is and the big overarching goal.
Thank you so much, Senator. Now I'm unmuted, right? Perfect. So Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador, it's developed a strategic framework for indigenization. I encourage you to look it up. It is very aspirational, and it was a very robust consultation. 26 consultations took place over a span of a year in every Indigenous community in the province, and it sets our pathway forward. It has 4 strategic priorities: leadership and partnership, teaching and learning, research and Indigenous student success. And there is a really interesting piece to it that it highlights that we need to make structural and systemic changes. And that's a very important aspect of our strategic framework. So the themes that emerged through this was increasing knowledge of Indigenous people and places, indigenizing the academy, and strengthening the community relations. And it complements so much of what we're doing. We have a strategic plan in which indigenization is critical, a critical piece of it called Transforming Our Horizons that came after the board approved the strategic framework. So, but they really aligned beautifully. And its, whole purpose is to strengthen the integration of Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. So we've also focused on the research piece, which is really important. We have an institutional policy, the first of its kind for our university, related to Indigenous research. And it's, again, a great document for you to look at. It outlines the principles and procedures necessary for ethical engagement and building of consent when partnering with Indigenous communities for research, and provides an effective, sensitive, and appropriate review of research impacting our Indigenous peoples. So those 2 documents are now our foundation that we will build on. But in addition to that, which came out of the strategic framework, we brought in a number of new positions. And it's tricky to bring in new administrative positions at a time of fiscal restraint, but we did make a new position, a VP Indigenous, which was appointed in June 2021, so just recently. The first one in our university, an AVP Indigenous Research, which is Violet Ford, the first Indigenous Inuit lawyer to become a lawyer in Newfoundland and Labrador. So we're excited about that. And they align also with our Vice Provost Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. We also engaged a cluster hire to hire 5 Indigenous tenure track academics at the same time. So there was lots happening. We have the Labrador Institute, in which we changed last year to become the School of Arctic and Subarctic Studies in Labrador. And that's really exciting because Labrador is a vast and amazing, we call it the big land. It's where I grew up. So I'm really happy that we were able to do that. And it provides an opportunity for people to get a post-secondary education in their own territory that's reflective of culture, their lands and ancestors. We had a special convocation in Labrador to honor a number of elders, which was wonderful. And our campus in Grenfell, which is on the west coast of Newfoundland and Labrador, has more than 300 Indigenous students on campus, and it's in traditional Mi'kmaq territory. And we've raised a Mi'kmaq flag to fly permanently and had, powwow. The 5th one is happening this weekend. So there's lots of things happening. Again, as my colleague, Dr. Hall said, lots still to do. I set up a task force, a presidential task force, to review all the names of all our buildings, roads, everything, to take a step back and make them inclusive and reflective of our province. So that would mean it needs to incorporate names that are Indigenous. We're looking at much around our campus in terms of the environment, much more of natural nature, and looking at that. And we just opened yesterday Juniper House, which is a new home for our Indigenous Student Center. And we have a dream to build Indigenous House, which would be much bigger. And on the Grenfell campus, also a Mi'kmaq Cultural Center. So all of those things are happening here. So lots of things to do, and lots of things happening, as they are in many of the universities. And my colleagues, I know, will share that.
Oh, great. Thank you, Dr. Timmins. And now I'll call on Professor Manfredi to talk about the vision in his university.
Well, thank you, Senator. Very pleased to be able to speak about that. In 2016, I launched the Provost Task Force on Indigenous Studies and Indigenous Education. The task force delivered its report in 2017, put forward 52 calls to action for the university, divided into 5 broad areas: student recruitment, physical representation, academic programming, research in the academic complement, and building capacity. My last survey suggests that we've either completed or made progress on 37 of the 52 calls to action. So we're making progress, but of course, we also have a ways to go. Some of the areas in which we have made progress, a few symbolic things, but they are symbolic, but symbols are important, and symbols are also highly visible. So for example, the decision to change the name of our varsity men's athletic teams from Red Men to Red Birds was very important, and hopefully that proved to be inspiring to some other athletic teams that have changed their names in the meanwhile. McGill University is located at the spot where the village of Hochelaga is said to have been located, and there was a rock with a plaque that commemorated that. It was in a very obscure location on campus, so we moved that to a very visible location on the main entryway to the campus. So those are just 2 symbolic, but I think highly visible and important things. We've created a dedicated Indigenous-led unit, which will soon be led by our first ever Associate Provost of Indigenous Initiatives. We hope to have that person in place before the end of this year. We've doubled the number of Indigenous faculty in the last 2 years. We are working to embed indigeneity into our campus master plan, into some very important capital projects that we have underway. We have created some important partnerships with communities. We are now delivering our full BEd program in community, started in Listigouche, and are now doing it in Kanawaki and working to do it in the Cree territory of Northern Quebec. We do, of course, have barriers or challenges. Like all universities, universities are resistant to change. On the one hand, that's a good thing. It's why we've been around for a very long time. On the other hand, it can be frustrating to bring change into any kind of university. Building awareness and knowledge of the Indigenous fact at the university and in our surrounding community is a challenge. That's important. One of the things we faced, and maybe others have too, is particularly with our Indigenous staff, making sure that they get the right mentorship and ensuring proper leadership transition and reducing staff turnover because of the challenges that some of our Indigenous staff face. So we have some work to do on the recruitment of students, but we've made some progress there and we're hoping to make more. So I'll stop with that.
Great, thank you very much. And then finally, Professor Flanagan for the vision at the University of Alberta.
Great, thank you, Senator. I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to participate. First, I just wanted to make a few remarks about the University of Alberta and our location here in Edmonton along the North Saskatchewan River. This is a location that for thousands of years, this has been a territory that has been a gathering place for diverse Indigenous nations, a place where diverse peoples, thinkers, scientists, philosophers have come to share and exchange knowledge. So as a university, we're really privileged to reside in this place, but we continue to work on understanding the full scope of what that means. And our response to the calls to action and our commitment to reconciliation means that we're learning how to respect and to be in good relations and good partnership with all those Indigenous knowledges, worldviews, and nations who've gathered here for millennia. I think our journey, a very important part in our journey was in 2005, the new institutional strategic plan for the University of Alberta committed to a thoughtful, respectful, meaningful, and sustainable response to TRC's calls to action. It was an important step. It put a strong, clear commitment right into the center of the university's strategic plan. And that laid the foundation for a number of very important investments in building our response to reconciliation. And after a wide consultation in 2019, we appointed our first ever Vice Provost, Indigenous Programming and Research. And we also promoted other key roles, such as an Indigenous Student Recruitment Manager, and also an Assistant Dean of Students, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Student Services. We've also achieved a number of other things, and I just wanted to highlight some of the things that we're particularly proud of at the University of Alberta. Our numbers of Indigenous students have grown dramatically. We've seen a 10% increase year over year since 2015. We've also set very ambitious targets for the recruitment of Indigenous faculty and nominating our Indigenous scholars as Canada Research Chairs. There's also a number of other university initiatives I just wanted to mention. One we're particularly proud of is our Indigenous Canada MOOC, and you might have heard of this. It's a free program, a free course made available to anyone available to anyone online on Indigenous Canada. And it's really the understanding and the perspective of these lands seen through the lens of Indigenous peoples. And it's been enormously influential. As I mentioned, over 400,000 people have successfully completed the course. So we're really proud, and that's the work of our Faculty of Native Studies that has put together this MOOC, one of the only faculties in the world dedicated to the study of Native studies. We've also, for over 20 years, had a Canadian Indigenous Languages and Literacy Institute, promoting the study and advancement of Indigenous languages. Also, our Aboriginal Teacher Education Program has been in operation for over 20 years, and over 300 graduates, Indigenous graduates, have gone on to work in grade schools as a result of this program. Also, our Rupert's Land Center for Métis Research. And I also wanted to mention our Institute for Prairie Archaeology, in particular, the work of our colleague, Keisha Supernaut. She's done groundbreaking work with a recent discovery, of course, in the residential schools of the unmarked graves, using remote sensing technology to identify these graves and really uncover this story, which is such an important one to uncover and acknowledge as part of the history of our country. Finally, just in closing, I did what every good academic might do in thinking about indigenization at the university, and I read a very interesting academic article by our colleague at the Faculty of Native Studies, Adam Gaudry, and a PhD student here at U of A, Danielle Lorenz. They talked about really 3 stages of indigenization in the academy. First, inclusion. Second, reconciliation, inclusion. And third, decolonial indigenization. And their thesis, and I think it was a powerful one, is that the post-secondary sector in Canada has made very important strides in advancing inclusion. But we've got a lot more to do when we think about reconciliation inclusion, which the authors describe as locating indigenization on common ground between Indigenous and Canadian ideals. And decolonialization indigenization is a whole overhaul of the academy to reorient knowledge production based on a balanced power relations between Indigenous peoples in Canada. So I just recommend that article to you. It was a powerful one for me to think about in reflecting on our path forward as a university. We've made great strides on inclusion. There's much more that we need to do on reconciliation inclusion and on decolonialization inclusion. So with that, I look forward to our discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you to all of the panelists. That there's a lot of information there, a lot that we can jump off from. One of the things that I wanted to ask you is sometimes it's easy to ask people, what are the, what have you achieved? But now I want you to dig a little deeper and talk about the challenges that universities have or face in that reconciliation process. And how do we overcome those challenges? So I'm going to start in maybe the reverse order this time, and I'll call on Professor Flanagan to just give 1 or 2 minutes about those challenges and what you're doing with them.
Yes, thank you, Senator. I think that is an opportunity perhaps for me to build on some of my reflections on the article that I mentioned, reconciliation, inclusion, and decolonialization, indigenization. I think inclusion, although important, absolutely critical as a first step to reconciliation. And as I mentioned, I think we have made significant strides. The next steps to reconciliation, I think, are much more complex and require a deep thinking of who we are as a university and of how we conduct our research, how we conduct our teaching, and how we think deeply about incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing and teaching and research in everything that we do. You know, we're enormously proud of our Faculty of Native Studies and the work that our Faculty of Education has done in advancing Indigenous education. But we need to think about medicine and science and engineering and law and business and the arts. We need to think about everything that we're doing across the academy to reflect on how we can incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing, thinking, understanding the world into everything that we do. And I think that's an important step in finding that common ground between Indigenous ideals and Canadian ideals, and deeply reflecting on that and what we do. And then I think longer term is that decolonization, where we actually have that is based on a balanced power relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canadians, something that is dynamic, something that is new. I mean, that begins, of course, with more faculty members, with more students, with more and even deeper engagement with inclusion. But inclusion is not enough. We have to think much more deeply about who we are as a university to advance truth and reconciliation.
Thank you. Professor Manfredi, the barriers that McGill has faced and the challenges and how they are being addressed.
Yeah, so I spoke about resistance to change, and I think it's the case that reconciliation at any of our institutions, and particularly at McGill, challenges the status quo and calls for a profound reflection in the way we normally see, think, and act, so that we can make room for a worldview that's unknown. It's always difficult to get people to make that pivot in the way they look at things. So from all levels of governance to our individual units and faculties, there's, I would say, it's a strange conundrum. On the one hand, there's a great deal of enthusiasm for moving forward on our calls to action, but there's also a bit of apprehension about doing the wrong thing, if I can say that. So people worry that they can either take a misstep, and that that in trying to move forward, they'll make a wrong step, and that can lead them to be criticized. So getting people to embrace it, getting people to take the risks that are associated with making these kinds of changes and with driving us towards reconciliation is one of the challenges. For McGill University in particular, I mean, we are a 200-year-old institution. We're both physically and in our symbols very much embedded in the very colonial practices that reconciliation is intended to address. And so that presents a challenge, everything from retrofitting 19th century buildings to be able to bring Indigenous representation into them, to just the very notion of symbolism that is associated with the colonial past that reconciliation aims to overcome. So I think those are some of the challenges that we face.
Great, thank you very much. And Dr. Timmins, the challenges and the ways that we overcome them.
So I'm going to repeat something that Dr. Hall said. I think racism is alive and well, and it is a big challenge. And how do we name it, shame it, and then educate so people are self-aware and work through that? I think the other thing to recognize right now, I mean, our universities do assimilate. I mean, they do. So Indigenous peoples who come, are young people who come to try to maintain their culture and own and value their own knowledge in a colonial, very Western environment is a challenge. And we have been trying to do things around that with land-based learning and a lot of different things that many that were mentioned here today, but it still is a challenge for us. I'll mention something I don't think anyone mentioned is our Indigenous faculty members and the expectations on them, that they're expected to be on committees and to educate their colleagues and to carry the Truth and Reconciliation initiative in our campuses. And I think a challenge is to do that shoulder to shoulder with them, allowing them to lead, but helping take part of that burden. And it's not a burden, but it's a journey. And for many, it becomes a burden when it's all on you. So a way to do that, to make sure that your senior team owns and recognizes that this is really, really important. So the whole challenge around how to support our Indigenous faculty. Language, I think language is huge. And I think one of the people in The chat room talked about it, how important language is and how we have a lot more work to do around both the study and preservation. It was Scott that mentioned it in their questions and answers around Indigenous languages. We recognize that we are losing them, and we need to, as universities, find a way to help them be revitalized. And lastly, curriculum change. What are we teaching and how are we teaching it? And how are we going to help and support our professors in to be able to bring Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous ways of knowing into what they teach, and do that respectfully? And I'll also mention identity politics is been huge in our post-secondary systems, and how to maneuver and work through all of that. So there's many challenges, but I want to end by saying there's been many. I think that the universities 10 years ago, we were a lot down. We've come a long way in 10 years, in a decade, in that every single institution has an Indigenous strategy. We're conscious of it. It's top of mind. It's a priority. And so we have come a long way. And Truth and Reconciliation report really was a turning point for many of us.
Thank you, Dr. Timmins. And finally, Dr. Hall on the challenges. You're muted, Dr. Hall.
Okay, so I think, look, for all of us, a challenge for universities is that we are universities with these medieval, old traditional cultures with university acts and governance, and that impedes a lot of the way that we can actually move. So, what we're trying to do at UVic has really changed that governance structure, changed the way we operate as a university. I had the privilege of requesting permission to work on the territory and include that in my installation. We held an installation following Coast Salish protocol. We didn't do it at a graduation ceremony. We didn't do it with pomp and circumstance. We did it the way the local Indigenous community wanted us to do it. And I think that's just showing that we just want to change the way we do all kinds of things at this university. And that means changing our governance. It was important to us. We created an Associate Vice President Indigenous. It doesn't sit in the academic division. It doesn't sit in the research division. It sits in the president's office. And it cross-cuts everything we do as an institution. It's looking at everything from our purchasing policies. Do we have an Indigenous purchasing policy where we prioritize a certain percentage of large projects going to Indigenous suppliers? That position looks at government relations. How do we influence the governments to do things like look at Indigenous knowledge, and can that be the foundation and formation of certain government laws, policies? When I was in Australia, a lot of the environmental policies are now based on Indigenous knowledge. So we're trying to drive that. We want to be an exemplar in our community. So not only do we need to fix our own campus, our own student body, faculty, and staff, we want to show some leadership in the community and really try to change the attitudes of people in the greater Victoria region. Some of that comes through telling the truth, the local truth. So instead of having a nice plaque saying the Hudson's Bay Company established Victoria in 18 whatever, we need to say, so many people were displaced and murdered. We need to get out there and work with the community to really tell the true history of this area. And I think the last one, and Vivian mentioned that, and I think I mentioned that in my opening, is this tax on our academics, our Indigenous academics, to do all the work they do. So we're working towards building an academic Indigenous caucus that will have a set of performance expectations, promotion and tenure, which will take into account and value what's done outside of the traditional count your publications, add up your grants, supervise graduate students. And we really want to value the impact that's being created by our Indigenous academics, which is absolutely fantastic. And then finally, to provide the right support to allow them to be successful in what it is, how they define success and impact, as opposed to our notion of what success is as an academic. So, thanks.
Okay, great. We did have a question about language, and it calls to mind, the elders teach us that everything we need to know about our culture, and certainly the nature of our relationships with all sentient beings, is embedded in our Indigenous language, in our Cree language where I grew up, in Métis language. And so I want to dig a bit deeper with you about how Indigenous languages are acknowledged at your university, and how in the day-to-day life of students, they are given an opportunity to interact with Indigenous language. And I'm going to start with Dr. Hall.
Yeah, we have a very strong program in Indigenous language revitalization. We've got a cohort of about 10 academics, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, working towards language revitalization. That's both at a graduate level, now at an undergraduate level, and there are a number of opportunities and courses for any students to take programs within those, to take any courses within their program. We want to build that out, make sure it's acceptable to many of the other programs that sometimes say, well, we can't do this because of accreditation, et cetera, et cetera. So we're trying to make these opportunities for students to work with that language. The other thing we're doing is really trying to make our local languages present on campus. We have 2 local languages, and sadly, there's not a lot of knowledge with one of the particular languages, which means we're having troubles having people translate some of our signs. But we see a point in time in the very near future where we'll have 3 languages in all of our wayfinding signs on campus along our campus greenway.
Great. Professor Flanagan, how is this happening? How is the interaction with Indigenous language being offered to students on the U of A campus?
Yeah, this is something we're actually really proud of, and this is our Canadian Indigenous Languages and Literacy Development Institute. And we offer training in over 5 Indigenous languages, and students are able to earn credit toward their degree in studying Indigenous languages. And we recognize that, as you mentioned, Senator, that language is such an important and fundamental way of understanding one's place in the world, and recognizing this and revitalizing this, and recognizing that this is also a core part of our role as a university located on these lands, is to honor and recognize the importance of Indigenous languages and contribute all that we can to the revitalization of Indigenous languages. I think it's also a really important way in which we can connect with Indigenous communities on these lands and build those links and demonstrate our commitment to building those links and providing that opportunity. And we know that for our Indigenous students, that sense of community, that sense of home, that sense of support within the university community is absolutely essential to their success as a student, and providing the kind of student experience that we want our Indigenous students to have. And we're very proud of our retention rate and graduation rate for our Indigenous students. And I think part of that reflects this commitment to support. And I think Indigenous languages as a very prominent part of that support and that commitment to providing that sense of community is something we're really proud of at the university.
Thank you. Dr. Timmins, I know that lots has been said. Do you have anything you'd like to add around, the incorporation of Indigenous languages in your university?
I'll just mention one point that, when we gave honorary degree to 2 Inuit elders where they live in Labrador last January, we provided their parchment to the honorary in their language, and Inuit language. And I think, that was really important for them as a sign of respect and acknowledgement. So it's not just about teaching the language, it's about also making sure that our systems and processes also acknowledge that there are other languages that belong to this place in which we reside.
Wonderful. And Professor Manfredi at McGill University, what is happening around Indigenous languages there?
Just a couple of things that I can mention. We have a very, I think, robust Indigenous languages revitalization program funded in part by the Mellon Foundation based in New York, with things like an Indigenous writer in residence, as well as supporting research in our linguistics department around Indigenous languages and revitalization. And I mentioned the B.Ed programs we're offering in community. Some of the courses in those programs are being offered in the local community's language. So we're not just delivering our usual programs in English. We're helping to revitalize the language in the community itself by offering some of the courses in the local language.
Thank you. And so for what might be my final question, we have a question that came through around removing systemic barriers for Indigenous students. And this is a question kind of close to my heart. I have a son who's now at the University of Alberta. He's a frequent flyer of First People's House. He receives a lot of support from First People's House, but that's only kind of the tip of the iceberg in providing students support, and particularly around removing systemic barriers. So I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to talk about how those barriers are removed and how students are supported. And we'll start with Dr. Timmins.
Well, many of our institutions have provided, as you mentioned, a safe place for students, Indigenous peoples, students to go, to study, to learn, but also to have food and celebration and cultural interactions with other Indigenous students and non-Indigenous students to help educate. That is critical, that there's a safe place that reflects them. I think their barriers are there. Barriers are all through our campus, through our processes and policies, and we try to, one by one to take them down and change them. But it will take a long time as we go through, and we, so much is on our students to help us, like to navigate the web, to register, all of those things for some communities, like in Labrador, who don't have internet. Some don't even have cell phone coverage. So how can students then, explore the university, find out? So the barriers are that dramatic in many ways for our first. When I was president of University of Regina in Northern Saskatchewan, the students did not have access to the internet so that they could find out about university and explore and look at options. So it's from the moment they touch us to the moment they graduate, there are barriers there that we have to be conscious of. We have to uncover. It's like an onion all the time, be aware of it, and then try to work with our students to make sure that they're enabled and supported, and providing wraparound services and educating our professors. That's really important, that our professors and our staff are also educated on the barriers our students face. That's critical.
Great, thank you for that answer. Professor Manfredi, how does the University of McGill support Indigenous students and remove systemic barriers?
Well, like many of these other universities, of course, we have a First People's House, which provides a welcoming home for our Indigenous students. We also try to provide wraparound services. Of course, many of our students, of course, are quite far from their own communities when they come to Montreal to study. So that presents a particular challenge to make sure that they don't suffer the alienation, not just the systemic barriers of the university's own bureaucracy, but the alienation of being located far from their own communities. Some things, bureaucratic things like in many cases, the funding disbursement from their nations doesn't quite line up with the university's own accounting practices. So you have to make accommodations for that. And it sounds like a silly thing, but it can be a really big thing, and it's something that needs to be fixed. So those are some of the ways that we've tried to deal with that.
Okay, thank you. I would go now to Dr. Hall about systemic barriers that students face.
Perhaps you just let the cat out of the bag with racism as well. I mean, I think we can talk about student support, First People's House. I think in addition to what my colleagues have all said, increasing the presence of elders on our campus has been really valuable for the students. But I think, really anti-racism is the number one factor that I see really hidden and buried, that all of our Indigenous students tell me. I'm try to meet with cohorts of 10 to 20 Indigenous students every week, and it's the same story all the time. It's racism either from their professors, from the staff, from the community, from fellow students. And so we've really got to tackle racism on the head at Canadian institutions. I think inclusion is an important part as well, right? You have to work hard to feel included. Diversity is often a numbers game. We calculate how many we've got of everything, but it's actually, do we create that inclusive platform that people come and feel included? And I think the last part for me is we're trying to work hard on trying to really figure out what decolonization means in a curriculum, for example, for students, in an environment for students, in a residence for students, and how do we work towards that decolonization that's actually meaningful for the Indigenous students in the local community.
Great, thank you. And Professor Flanagan, I don't know if you have anything to add, but I'm sure you do, around removing those systemic barriers for Indigenous students on your campus.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. Of course, I'm very pleased to hear that your son has found a very important support at First Peoples House at the university. And I'm sure you know Elder Dr. Whiskey Jack, who's been such an important resource for First Peoples House. And I've had an opportunity to visit First Peoples House and meet with Dr. Whiskey Jack. And I have to say, the energy that I feel there and the sense of community that is so palpable when you walk in the door, and you can immediately get a sense of how important it is for our students to thrive in what they're doing at the University of Alberta, to have this home, to have Elder Dr. Whiskey Jack to go to speak to. And so when I think of systemic barriers, I think of the ways in which our system is structured that create barriers for Indigenous peoples and our Indigenous students to advance. And of course, there are many barriers. But I think one of the most important is that if our Indigenous students do not see themselves not only reflected in what the university is, in their professors, in the administrators who are helping them, but if they don't also see themselves and their history and their culture and their ways of knowing reflected in what they're studying and how they're learning at the university, that this creates an enormous systemic barrier, because if students don't see themselves reflected in the university, if they don't see that their ways of knowing and knowledge in their communities are valued and embraced, if they don't see that, really, it can't be just First Peoples House. It has to be when you go to the registrar's office. It has to be when you're taking you're going to the science lab, when you're working in the Faculty of Engineering, when you're doing work at the Faculty of Education. So again, I think this goes to Dr. Hall's point about decolonization, how we need to think and reflect very deeply about how we can become that university that has created this equal partnership with Indigenous peoples, ways of knowing and understanding the world.
Okay, as much as I would like to continue this conversation for another couple of hours, we're running out of time. And I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to give me 1 or 2 sentences of the role of the university in the reconciliation process in Canada. And, in listening to your thoughtful responses, I know that this includes thoughtful and deep structural change at the university. I hear that it includes addressing racism on campus. I understand that it includes language incorporation, and it includes both symbolic and concrete action. And I'll call on you in the order that we started with to give this audience an idea of, the 10,000-foot view of the role of universities in the reconciliation process as concisely as you can. So, Dr. Hall.
Yeah, well, look, I think one of the truths of the findings of the TRC was that education was really instrumental in the violence perpetuated on Indigenous people across this country. At the same time, recognizing that education was the way forward. And I think we just have a responsibility to ensure that all of our students, faculty, and staff are really knowledgeable about the history of abuse and racism, within the Indigenous peoples of Canada, and the enduring and negative impact colonialism has had. And that means we have to rise to this challenge of anti-racism. We have to embrace our responsibility to ensure Indigenous students have a welcoming environment, right? We have to really work to decolonize in a way that's meaningful to Indigenous peoples. And, finally, we have to really embrace the concept of working towards self-determination. Those are big, lofty goals, but are going to require a lot of effort and thought.
Perfect. I'll call on Dr. Timmins now for your summarizing of the role of universities in the reconciliation process.
Thank you, Senator. I think it's really important as universities that we are open and recognize that there's so much knowledge that we do not have and we do not own. And that knowledge is embedded in community. And we need to partner it with a very open approach so that we can learn from people who hold that knowledge. So that is critical. Elders, knowledge keepers, but also families. It's so much that we do not know, and that we must, as a university, keep the TRC truth and reconciliation conversation going, those discussions alive and well, that we must always have them in mind. And we have to challenge ourselves to look at what we do through an Indigenous lens with the support, shoulder to shoulder, of our Indigenous colleagues. And I think all of that is really important, and that is our role. We educate the future, and we educate young people as leaders in this country, and we need to educate them with an open mind, open heart, and a recognition that Indigenous language, history, culture, art, stories have been invisible, and it's time for them to have their place in our histories. But that's through our educating our youth.
Perfectly summarized. Thank you, Dr. Timmins. Next, Professor Manfredi, for your summary statement.
Sure, thanks. One of the themes of McGill's bicentennial is the idea of opportunities that open doors, and universities have provided many opportunities that have opened many doors for much of the Canadian population. But of course, we've also been involved in structures that have closed doors and taken away opportunities from many of the Indigenous people of Canada. And so I think universities, first of all, have to recognize that fact and then take the reparative measures that are necessary to address it.
Very, very good. And finally, Professor Flanagan.
Thank you, Senator. On the question of what is the role of universities in advancing truth and reconciliation, our role is foundational. As I mentioned at the outset, the University of Alberta was founded in 1908 with a very noble mission to advance all the people, to uplift all the people. But for too long, the people did not include the Indigenous peoples of these lands. And so this is a history that we as a university need to correct. And the mission, really the core mission of universities, has always been to envision the society that we all want to live in, a society that is inclusive, that provides opportunity for all, that is just, that advances equity. And so this is always something we're striving for. We're never going to get to that perfect destination. But universities have always had such an important role in advancing critical thinking and advancing society as we push the boundary of how we can build that society we all want to live in. And as I mentioned, building that society, that vision of uplifting the whole people, for too long did not include the Indigenous peoples of this land. So we as a university, all of universities, need to recognize that history. We need to change that history, and we need to seize our mission going forward to build a truly inclusive vision of that society that we all want to live in.
Thank you very much. I want to thank our esteemed panel for your thoughtful answers, for your commitment to reconciliation. And I want to thank the University of Victoria for including me in this process. And I will turn it over now to Dr. Guttini.
Yeah, merci beaucoup, and thank you very much for this fascinating conversation. So, thank you, Senator, for masterfully actually steering this conversation, this delicate and important conversation. We are really proud of this partnership that we do have with the Senate of Canada and bringing these conversation to and trying to move this conversation forward. The conversation will continue with the Victoria Forum, and I hope this initial discussion that we had today will open actually the door for moving things forward. As you know, the Victoria Forum is a continuation of this conversation, and I would like to put this panel actually on the spot. And I would like to suggest a way to continue this conversation is to organize a roundtable in Victoria in April 2022 around the same topic, but this time actually have a better representation in terms of stakeholders, like, for example, Indigenous people, students, faculty, businesses, politicians, in order to draft a way forward and how universities really can move not just the conversation, but a plan of action that you can be all part of it. So the invitation is open. As we heard from you today, there are a lot of good ideas, but it will be actually great to start really creating a repository of these good practices and lessons learned and work with others. So, le Forum de Victoria tient à remercier ses partenaires fondateurs, Thales et Vancity, pour leur support. Et nous allons continuer la conversation durant le Forum de Victoria qui aura lieu en avril 2022, entre le 20 et le 22. Une des idées qu'on propose, c'est de continuer cette conversation durant le forum et avoir des représentants des universités canadiennes, mais d'autres universités du monde pour pouvoir développer des solutions futures qui peuvent amener des solutions pratiques, qui peuvent partager des leçons apprises et améliorer la vie des gens autour des universités. So thank you for your participation. It was an enjoyable and provocative conversation. We hope we will continue this conversation during the Victoria Forum.